Yes, guys, welcome back to the Cannon podcast with no Bhavs, unfortunately, today. But here we are, George and myself, to chat through all things Arsenal in this seemingly never-ending international break, George.
Yeah, I think going into the break, I
Oh,
felt as
God.
though
It's so long.
it's really bad. I felt like going into the break, I'd like, Arsenal could do with a break. We've got a lot of injured people kind of piling up. I thought,
Yeah,
we could do with it. And then while you're in it, I'm sitting here, I'm trying to
yeah.
think, what do I do with my time and my Saturdays? I've got this open slot.
But is it just me? Am I making this up? I swear there's more international breaks this year. It
I
feels like
think there
that.
is. Haven't we had like three? I thought historically we've had what, two? Maybe
I think maybe
one.
it's because it's a Euros year.
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, it's just too much. Get rid of it, I say. Just get rid of it. Just Arsenal. Just Arsenal, Man City every single weekend till the end of
Super
time.
League. You heard it here first.
Well, welcome back to the Cannon Podcast. Hope you guys are all doing well. Let's just get started. So we saw. But by the way, I'm no Babs, so there's going to be no smooth transitions. It's just going to be new topic. Essentially, I want to talk about the Martinelli situation. So we saw
Mhm.
Martinelli starting at centre forward. I put a video out about this on my own channel. People got very angry at me saying he didn't play the whole game there. I'm aware, but he started at centre forward alongside Rodrigo and then
Yeah.
headed over to the left hand side. More broadly, let's be honest, because I think he scored a good goal and his movement was interesting on that goal specifically. We could possibly talk about that, but more broadly, I know you've spoken for a while or thought a while about Martinelli being a centre forward and why and how he suits that. I have
Mhm.
my reservations, but why don't you put the case forward for why you think he could be a centre forward? Because I know you've mentioned it.
Well, I think firstly, I don't want to sit on the fence, but you have to admit that this isn't a black and white decision. I think that the boy can explode at left wing and he can explode at striker. For me, it's about isolating the key traits that make Martinelli special individually, not talking about how best to communicate with the team, just analyzing purely what does Martinelli bring. And I think in order to kind of keep your front line together, you can operate in kind of two major folds, and you can't discard the future nine discussion from this topic because you start looking at Osimhen, Holland, Darwin Nunez, Evan Ferguson. We've talked about it on this channel how I feel that this new type of channel running nine is going to be the new modern way forward, and
And
uh,
sorry to cut across you, but I do think that context is important.
it is, and that's why I kind of speak about this transition because you need to separate the argument for what you believe Martinelli is best as, and then how do we adapt to modern football coming in, and how do we make both of these two synonymous? Anyways, to get off the fence about what's the case for Gabby at striker. So I think when you look at Martinelli in general, the best thing that he's able to do is find space when there is none. I talk about on the wing, I talk about in the box. I think he's just such a sharp mover in those first 5 yards. He's able to create separation in a multitude of ways. The one thing is he's very straight line running in the way that he does complete his kind of his separation. And I find that when I look at a player who is able to find space in the channel so easily, I look at a player who is so good at retaining the ball in contact, and I look at a player who, for me, his movement and finishing instincts are far better in central areas than they have been wide historically throughout his career. Even if he's arriving off the left, or even if he's starting off in the left,
I mean, it
you
is
can,
easier to finish centrally, but yeah.
yeah, but he almost doesn't second guess the instinct or the shot. Too many times we've seen Martinelli pull up and not take the shot first time. Too many times have we seen him not cut across his body to finish far post when he is at left wing. When you analyze the finishes centrally, it's not just that the space is open for him. He doesn't guess, he doesn't second guess or hold that release as quickly. You also need to factor in the aerial ability. I think people have forgotten it because they don't remember early Martinelli cameos with Unai
Mm.
Emery. But Gabriel Martinelli is one of the best headers of the ball, particularly given his size. Look back at Olympiacos cameos, and he's going over Tapsoba in those
Mm.
clips to win headers and change direction. It's not just the Nottingham Forest cameos. His
Mm.
early days with Unai Emery had him as a striker, and when I look at his big performance against Liverpool with Klopp, that showed me kind of a whole new world in a sense about what his ability could
Sing
be
it.
central. I'm not doing that. But when you combine kind of the aerial ability as well as the sharp movements, and then broadly you start kind of talk about his retention and how best to use his speed, his pressing ability, there's been a lot of debates about how we can fit Martinelli in. I just think if you were to put him central with those traits in mind, you maximize his ability. And the profile comparison that I've made in the past is Luis Suarez. It's something that Mikel agrees with. When I first made it, a couple months later, Rio Ferdinand kind of disclosed that, he saw through talking with Mikel that he saw a bit of Suarez about him. And the Suarez link, by the way, is that slow movement. Sorry, not slow movement, but finding space in the box, that movement to create separation in the first 5 yards. That's what Luis Suarez was brilliant at. That was his superpower. So that's my case for the striker position, at least.
Yeah, and I foresee, I think, on that Suarez comparison, I can foresee that ability. The thing that I loved with Suarez, it felt like he could score every type of goal. Every type of goal. There was no sort of limit to that, and he wouldn't necessarily excel in one type of goal, but he could do almost everything, I think. Yeah, I think it absolutely. I think what you mentioned in terms of it not being black and white is bang on. He could explode both sides. It depends on the league context, which I want to come to in a second. Also depends on how Arsenal are going to be setting up. It may well be that Martinelli's the perfect striker for a alternative universe version of Arsenal. Do you know what I mean? It's not to say that he would be a bad option there. It's just, does it work, alongside Saka and whoever comes in at left wing if he was going to do that? It's also to say two things as well. Not that it has to be a black and white option again, in terms of he could play centre forward sometimes and not at other times. And also he can come more, I think, especially when Trossard plays false nine, he comes a lot more centrally anyway. So there's gradients to these things. And the context I was trying to set you up for before, but don't have the hosting skills for, was essentially around the difference in which you put me onto, which I think is a banging point. The difference in the league in the sense that you look back at, say, the 2010s, mid-2010s, who's thriving? It's Pochettino's Spurs, it's Leicester on that counter-attacking team. Teams are a little bit higher up, a little bit more attritional. When control comes in, when Pep's control model becomes basically the way you win leagues, teams sit a little bit further back and you have to move defenders differently. In that model, when defenders are a bit deeper, you're facing more low blocks, as we are this season. Do you want, let's say, closer to how do you want to move defenders, essentially, is the question. And can Martinelli move defenders physically? A bit harder. So I don't know. And it kind of, it's not to say, as in he can move them with his movement and, he could, get in behind, but there is less space there, I think. And you want a bit more physicality. I think it's fascinating. I think it's one of those things where, even if he doesn't do it this season, next season, it will always be a kind of, it's like Saka moving centrally. I think people will always go, you want your best players closer together. You want your best, closer together and closer to the goal. And the final thing I'll finish on as well is his finishing. I think I looked at his numbers, his XG numbers. He scored
his
15.
Overperformance is among the best in the league.
It is the best.
He does that. Yeah.
I looked up for a video for people who scored at 15 or more. So he scored 15 goals last season or more. He had the highest overperformance. He had 9.87 XG. Harry Kane was 21 XG, 30 goals. But again, he'd have to be down from 15 XG. I know it's a higher thing, so it's slightly different. But yeah, in terms of overperformance as a percentage, he's got the highest numbers. So I see the vision. Speaking,
you know what it is too. Sorry, just at one point with it, because when you talk about the low blocks, there's one thing that you do need to mention. You can move people physically, but the movement is actually what's key to removing that low block. And so you look at strikers, by the way, it doesn't just have to be Martinelli, but you look at Cavani in the past, who was a brilliant player at his movement, but he wasn't necessarily, despite being 6'1", 6'2", he didn't move people in that same way. You can achieve goals really differently. I think the big debate here, though, is say you were to get an Evan Ferguson, a Højlund, those type of strikers that are more predominantly central, right? You're inevitably going to keep Martinelli wide more often than you are if he was central. And so if you're okay with that type of striker, and you basically give Evan Ferguson, Højlund, Tony their central space, but you take it away from Martinelli, now that could work. That trade-off could be worth it. But then that's when I think the debate, I just wanted to loop it back, where what's best for Martinelli may not be what's best for the team moving forward and for what modern football's demanding. That's a separate question. I still think you can blend the two, because you get somebody like an Osimhen, a Sesko. These are big, tall, channel-running nines with presence, but also like to drift wide. So you get this overlap. You can achieve things in the same way, but it isn't as clear black and white as I think a lot of the Twitter wars want to make you seem on it.
But I think you're right. It's like when you are inserting your favorite centre forward prospect in your mind into Arsenal, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers.
Absolutely.
And we have to consider who we want those losers to be. So that's big question. Speaking of inserting prospects into Arsenal, bloody hell.
They say he can't.
They said all the comments. Chido Obi scored, what was it, 40 million goals at the weekend against Liverpool, I think U16s. To say I know anything about the player would be a lie, so go for it.
Look, the funny thing is, for all the shouts of an Osimhen, he is the baby Osimhen in terms of profile. He is
Don't do
that.
This to me, George. Don't do this.
He is that kind of striker that you want. He's a 6'2", 15-year-old, by the way. He's not quite 16 yet, and his frame is incredible. The one thing that I also like, kind of combining, I was like profile.
3 at 15. Jesus Christ.
It's incredible. It's insane. But you know what it is? It's the technical ability that's married with this physical presence. Mate, he's got the dribbling ability of Alexander Isak. He can throw feints. The ball's glued to his feet. And that's where that superstar potential comes in, because he doesn't rely on the physical needs, which he has, by the way. He can burn people with push and run because he's just so physically dominant at that age group. But it's that technical ability, and that also that ability in terms of the variety of his finishing. It's quite big. He's dominant aerial presence. He's also somebody that is a pressing option from the front. He doesn't shirk his defensive responsibilities. Very few cons. Like when I start to analyze cons about his game, they're simply experience related. They have nothing to do with his understanding of space, positional aspects. He can fill gaps. He's not opposed to doing the hard yards. He's got a brilliant presence out wide as well, because his dribbling ability allows him to find positions out wide and to carry as well. He's not somebody that just needs maybe the first 5 yards to exploit dominance. He's not just, for example, I look at Evan Ferguson, who I don't think has developed that ball carrying trait as highly yet. He's somebody that will thrive at the top of the key, and somebody that you create space for, or he creates space for himself, and bang, he's a shooter. But he's not somebody that would come deep, involve himself into play, and necessarily dribble himself out of trouble. That's not quite Evan yet. Chido has that. And so you start to project and you start to say, what could this boy be? He gets headlines. I kind of talked about it on, I think, this podcast and other ones, that this was a name to think about, but he's exploding at a really high rate, mate. Like, he's already too good for the U16s. Internationally, he's performing at the U19 and U17 levels. He's already made his debut for the U21s, and he's played like over 6 times for the U18s right now. It's almost like we're talking about a new name every week, and people are like, well, you're just overhyping youth. No, like, this is a player that I think has serious potential and has been earmarked by Arsenal to have serious potential. A lot of things can happen between now and him making his first team debut. But one thing I'll end on is Denmark is coming under a talent pool explosion currently. He's part of that explosion.
Yeah, who they got? They got Højlund. They've got another dude. What's his name? I think he plays for a Spanish team. There's someone. There's another like Danish prospect there on once. I've had a few messages saying have a look at this guy.
Naipen, but he's really young.
Yeah. The more broadly though on the academy, because you make a good point. It feels like there is a lot of like names. There's you got your Kozia Dubrees, Miles Lewis Skelly, Wanyeri, Chido Obi. There's some kid who's like 13 and playing for the
Max Dowen.
Yeah. So what is that? Is that a tide change at Hale End? Is that just a particularly special group of players? Is it the Mertesacker approach? What do you put that down to?
I definitely think it's an approach in scouting.
And do you think we're overhyping as well? Like, is that a worry?
It certainly is a worry when I think people that don't watch the academy maybe cite names. And I think when you don't put the caveat that there are some people that you cite for a squad role, and then some people that you cite for the first team. Like, that's a very specific step. I've talked about how I love Mario Kozia-Dewberry. I, for example, haven't said that he's a first team potential. I think he could come in to be as a Saka backup. That's a very different role to maybe how I talk about Miles Lewis Skelly, my real favorite kid, and who I think could be a serious player.
I think your favorite person ever. I think
Probably, yeah.
maybe more favorite than your mom, just
I
anyone.
love him more than my family. He is my family. But I think that gradient.
Sorry, George, if you've missed how many times he's shouted out Miles Skelly, that's hilarious because there's people who think you love a 16-year-old in the Arsenal Academy more than your family. But this George has been propping this dude for like 3 years.
It's true. I mean, like, but I think that gradient expectations is where overhyping happens, right? And I think that there's some people that talk about these kids in very high terms, like myself, but also acknowledge that it's a journey and that every youth pathway is unique and it's not linear as well. There's going to be moments of ups and downs, but I think in terms of what's changed at the academy, there's certainly been a greater profiling and scouting presence in technical plus physical traits. Because look at the class of Bukayo Saka with Reece Nelson and Emile Smith Rowe and compare that to the current Ethan Neri, Aiden Heaven, who's another player that's come up, by the way, Miles Lewis Skelly. Look at the profile of these midfielders and look at their physical gifts and compare that with older classes. There's a distinct difference. So the Arsenal Academy has definitely highlighted this as a problem, I think, going forward. And they've looked at making sure that all of the prospects that come up are at a certain physical level that allows them to play because they understand that the technical ability has been Arsenal heritage for so long. And I think when you've seen people make the step up, the physical portion is really the detractor for me. I think talent you can see as young as 13 years old. We see it, right? Max Dow is a perfect example. You see the boy can dribble. You don't need me to tell you he looks like Jack Wilshere, like when you see a comp or something, right? The thing that really makes people make the step up, at least from a coaching perspective for me, is can they marry that technical ability with adults? And do they have the frame to sustain that contact? And then B, do they have the mental ability to commit to having a full-time career? Because you can have a player with all the technical and all the physical gifts, but that's not mentally clued in. And that can be the difference between making it at the top level. So to round up and not sit on the fence, I definitely think Arsenal have changed their youth scouting approach in general. I see a clear difference in the type of players that are coming up from Hale End and their preparedness physically to enter the first team. And then lastly, I think in terms of the overhyping aspect, there's an aspect of people that overhype most names, but I will say we've got 2 or 3 players that I firmly believe are in the conversation for some of the best talents that we've produced at the club. And that's not just coming from myself, that's coming from scouts that have worked there quite a bit and coming from the brilliant Hale End documentary that released last year. There's a really prominent Arsenal scout that said the exact same thing, where there is a jump, there is a present talent pool, much in the same way that the famous United team came through with a great amount of talents. I think Arsenal are experiencing a similar talent explosion.
It's so exciting. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's incredibly exciting. The only thing I'd add to your list from earlier is the timing. Like, you need to have the right timing and that pathway into the first team. Emile Smith Rowe, I always talk about this. Like, I think Emile Smith Rowe could have been one of those players who was very, very talented. Like maybe you look at like a Chuba Akpom or something. Just, I'm not comparing them talent wise. I'm just talking about pathway wise. In terms of, was always on the fringes, but just never quite got the opportunity and had to move away. And I think Smith Rowe just had that moment, 26th of December, 2020. You come in, that's your moment, and then you make your career. So,
well, Marcus Rashford, that's how he came on the scene. Really.
Someone was injured in the warm-up, right? And now he's, one of England's biggest stars. So, yeah, I think these are, there's, a lot to look forward to. Let's move forward to some status updates. So I want to do some looking ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe projecting forward with 3 players. We want to talk about Reece Nelson, we want to talk about Trossard, and we talk about Kivior. Just in terms of, I think all 3 players maybe have some question marks over their head in terms of their involvement. There's no sort of urgency necessarily with any of them in terms of, are they going to move out in January? I don't see that happening for any of those guys. But, next 18 months, there's going to be some question marks because it's, for example, with Leandro Trossard, is he happy to take the squad role? With Kivior, maybe there's a development opportunity. Does he take a loan somewhere and we do something with him? Reece, similarly, I think, obviously signed the contract, but I haven't seen enough minutes. Let's start with Reece. I love him. I love him so much. I love that game against Brentford. I thought it was fantastic. It feels to me, though, with Reece that whenever he comes in, and does well, you get that initial moment where Reece, it's like, okay, well now this is Reece's moment, or there's a perfect opportunity this weekend against, Sheffield Wednesday at home, whatever it is, or Sheffield United, sorry, at home, to go and at least I didn't call them Sheffield, to go and get him started or whatever, give Martinelli 45 minutes off or whatever it is, and just give him that moment. And it feels like he never quite gets there, and I don't know what that is. Like you can project forward and say, is it Arteta not trusting him, or I don't know. Where are you at with Reece? Thanks for checking out the Cannon Podcast. To hear the full episode, sign up as a YouTube member on this channel or go to patreon.com/thecannonpod.